to Real People, Real Life.
Okay, Steve. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Came out here to see Eric. Eric was on yesterday. Fantastic conversation. Why historically we've seen this with the Jewish population? Tell everyone a little bit about your expertise as far as understanding the history, et cetera.
So, I mean, my own personal acquaintance with the topic. Of course, I'm a rabbi, and I have a background in intellectual history.
Okay.
Particularly my doctorate was in the area of Second Temple era literature. So from about the year 400 BC or BCE up until about the year 200 AD or CE. Mm-hmm. And then kind of how ideas migrate and move through different cultures and civilizations based on Jewish intermediaries is the specifics, but it's really just intellectual history in general.
Okay.
And so, with your permission, what I'll do is show that what's happening today is not disconnected from what actually has been a function of Western human history, at least for 3,000 years.
Understood. Yeah, absolutely. That's really what we want to get into. Mm-hmm. I intend to learn, and I know a lot of people would be very interested in understanding the intellectual path.
Mm-hmm. So, the earliest manifestation of what we would call anti-Semitism today is found in the book of Exodus in the Bible. So the Pharaoh is talking to his advisors, and he says, "Listen, we got to do something about these Jews. There's a whole lot of them, and what happens when our enemies invade? The Jews are going to help our enemies." And so Pharaoh says we have to enslave them. That's really the first time in recorded history that you find anti-Semitism.
And what was Pharaoh's logic behind the Jews siding with the enemy versus with the Egyptians?
So it's, some of your your viewers may be, or listeners may be familiar with Thomas Sowell.
Okay.
He's a conservative thinker, African-American, brilliant man. He's written a number of really deeply incisive sociological studies. And in one of his books, he talks about anti-Semitism and the function that Jews play in different societies. And so kind of the surface take on anti-Semitism is Jews are a very convenient blank screen. Jews have been a convenient blank screen for 3,000 years because they're not part of the majority. And so the cultures in which they live see them as a blank surface onto which you can map those issues that are troubling or unsettling, or that people who are angry, or those issues that they're angry about.
So a scapegoat population.
Scapegoating. Sure. And Jews, in Asia, and Thomas Sowell talks about it, in Asia it's the Chinese. And in Europe, in many cases, it was the Volksdeutsch. And so after World War II ended, there was a tremendous persecution of Volksdeutsch.
What are
in Eastern Europe. They are
Volksdeutsch?
ethnic Germans
Okay.
who maintained their German identity. They spoke German, they dressed German, they ate German food, even though they lived in Czechoslovakia, or they lived in Poland, or they lived in other countries. And the Volksdeutsch became the symbol of rage of the culture in which they lived. But Jews, and the issue surrounding Jews throughout history has transcended culture, because Jews are a different religion. So any society outside of Israel where Jews live, they're immediately a religious minority. And when religion plays a very important role in society, it's very easy to map those religious fears onto that minority population. So a good example is in the Middle Ages, there was a real fixation on Satan and Satan's presence in the world. particularly, but not restricted only. I mean, the Catholic Church, clearly the role of Satan in the world is a very powerful one.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, when you had people who dressed differently, spoke a different language, ate different foods, wouldn't marry your children and your children wouldn't marry them, you could look at them and say, well, our anxiety about Satan, we're going to map onto them. They're allied with Satan.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. If you look in the 1950s, during the Red Scare in the United States, politically, people were very anxious about communism. And there were certainly, Jewish communists. I mean, there were Catholic communists, there were Lutheran communists, there's
a political ideology.
Right, it's a political ideology. But it was easy for people to map onto this minority, oh, the Jews are communist. And so a disproportionate number of the people who were blacklisted were Jews. But nobody said we're blacklisting them because they're Jews. They just said, this group is influenced. What is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is really, at its simplest level, mapping your anxieties or your anger onto the blank screen. And I say it's a screen. If you go to a movie theater, there's no such thing as a horror movie screen. You project a horror movie onto the screen.
Correct.
There's no such thing as an action screen. You go to the movie theater, and maybe yesterday they had a romance, and today they have a car chase and crashes, and tomorrow there's a horror movie, and the next day it's a historical, treatment. The screen itself hasn't changed. It's what you project on the screen. So it's the same thing with Jews. It's whatever movie a particular society in a particular moment chooses to project onto Jews as the blank screen of anxiety in that society. And
now, what would be the reason that such a tight community? Because the Jewish people that I know and are friends with, they have strong family values, strong work ethics. They put people first. They have they serve. They serve people. I think that they're and very kind. The fear of the masses are then portrayed on the minority.
Well, I mean, so there are organized efforts to resist anti-Semitism, and I hate to use the word combat it because it's kind of militaristic, but there are. So, for instance, in the United States, there's the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, and they have been around for over a century to try to, legally challenge anti-Semitism, to educate the public about the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Why the problem is, to a certain extent, every infant that is born doesn't know anything. So yeah, every human being, every time a kid is born, you have to start all over again. There is no incremental progress as a species. Individual societies may have incremental progress. People, have you seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail?
Of course.
Okay. So you remember the scene with the witch. How do you know she's a witch? Well, witches float. What else floats? Well, ducks float. And wood floats. So you remember that scene, and it's kind of like, how could people be that ignorant? But every child without an education is going to be that ignorant.
And a reflection of how they're raised.
Right. And so, there was a famous medieval Jewish philosopher named Moses Maimonides. And there actually is schools named after him, Jewish schools. There's hospitals named after him. He was really a Renaissance thinker, one of the greatest minds of the Middle Ages. He, and again, going back to my own field, he took the Islamic philosophy of the Muslim philosophers, Al-Farabi and Averroes, and he kind of translated them for his Jewish audience and applied it to Jewish theology and philosophy. And then it was translated into Latin by Jews from Judeo-Arabic by Jews who had converted to Christianity. It was before the split between the Protestants and the Catholic Church, so it was just Christianity. And it was translated into Latin, and then Thomas Aquinas used Maimonides' book in his Summa Theologica. So Maimonides, the question was, why did prophecy end? We had all these great prophets in the early period, and I'm not going to go into Maimonides' philosophy of how prophecy works. But basically what Maimonides said was, no one can rise above the level of knowledge and ethics of the society in which they live. We're all a prisoner of the culture and the society in which we live. Some people can be at the summit of Mount Everest, and some people can be at the bottom of Death Valley, but you can't rise above the limits of the society in which you live.
And that was
around the year 1200.
And was that the basis of what prophets actually did by increasing the level or enlightenment to a new level in society? Was that the historical?
He didn't go into that at that level, but basically he said that the society in which you live controls the amplitude.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and so what he said was, for instance, in the Golden Age, and he was, in the Middle Ages, they tended to look backwards, and he said in the Golden Age, people were so morally perfected that they perceived God's truth in the universe around them all the time. And he also, he believed that scientific knowledge and theology were very much interrelated. And he said, if you want to understand God, look at the world around you, because no human being is capable of immediately perceiving and connecting with God per se. You can only connect with God through your surroundings. And so, he saw Moses as the most perfected prophet because he was the most perfected moral person and was the most perfected in terms of knowledge of science. And again, you see an echo of the Islamic theology of Muhammad. The idea that Muhammad was a perfected human being, and therefore he received prophecy because he was so spiritually and morally and intellectually prepared to receive prophecy.
Got it.
So, but Maimonides, it's very interesting because if you look at it that way, my dad always used to say, Jews are the canary in the coal mine for any society in which they live. If the society is persecuting Jews and is rife with anti-Semitism, it means society is very sick. Because it has reached a point of morally, intellectually, because it means that a society has reached the stage where they are beginning to map their anxieties onto human beings that they consider to be outsiders. And so, right now, anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews is apolitical. There are anti-Semites on the left, there are anti-Semites on the right. Their reasons for hating Jews are different. But, so if you look,
because the fears of the right, the fears of the left, then get projected on the scapegoat.
Right. And if you look, for instance, the most visible discussion around anti-Semitism right now is college campuses. And the protests last spring against Israel and anti-Israel sentiment. So, there are some on the left who argue that I'm anti-Israel, I'm not an anti-Semite. And in fact, there are not a small number of Jews who are part of groups that are very anti-Israel. As an educator, I taught some young students who became leaders in the pro-Palestinian anti-Israel movement. It's kind of a shock to me because I tend to think of myself as very much a moderate on vis-a-vis either extreme. But so if you look on the college campuses, well, what's the prevailing ideology on college campuses right now? It's not anti-Semitism. It's a neo-Marxist anti-colonial fervor.
Okay.
Okay, it's this idea that white Europeans came in.
You're doing it perfect because I wanted to define that because that's
I'm going to break
a big
it down.
long
It's
sentence.
neo-Marxist, but it's white colonists came in. They colonized all of the global South. Brown people, depending on how you break that down. But they were the classical Marxism. It was the rich against the poor, and it was the ownership class against the working class. The proletariat, and so in this neo-Marxist ideology, it's the white European colonists who have oppressed the brown and black and indigenous peoples.
Okay, I understand.
Okay, and so they look at Israel and they say, we don't hate Jews. We hate colonialism. And Israel is a white European colonial experiment.
Okay.
And they call it, the Zionist project and those, there's all kinds of fancy terms for it. I won't go into it. So what they do is they take this neo-Marxist lens and then they map it onto the blank screen of Jews. The archaeological evidence is that Jews have lived in Israel since at least the year 1500 BC. Jews and before, Jews is a term that was coined by the Romans because
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, the history of terminology, if you look in the Bible, it's Israelites.
That's correct.
The children of Israel. After the northern 10 tribes were conquered and carried off into captivity by the Babylonians in the year 597 BCE. And I say BCE because Jews say before the Common Era, not before Christ. So in 597 BCE, in 713, the northern tribes are conquered, and they're carried off into, Sennacherib, and if you've read the book of Tobit, Catholics have the apocryphal books are part of their canon. And Protestants call them apocryphal or deuterocanonical. So the book of Tobit is about this guy whose family was carried into captivity, who still identifies as Jewish, living in exile that was carried off. But at that point, there were two and a half tribes left that were left in the original land area identified with Israelites.
Which is
the tribe of
Israel.
Judah,
Right.
the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin.
Okay.
And then there were also remnants of the tribe of Levi, the priestly families that kind of were left behind. So the overwhelming majority were Judean. They were probably 85% of the population, 80 to 85%. They were the descendants of the tribe of Judah. They affiliated with the tribe of Judah. So the Romans come in. It's a long story, but the Romans wind up dominating that region. Originally, the Greeks dominated the area after Achilles. I'm blanking. What's his name? The Great. Having a senior moment here.
Alexander.
But, Alexander the Great comes in. Israel becomes actually goes out, and there's it's obviously, again, it's an apocryphal story, but the high priest goes out and welcomes Alexander and says, "Thank God you're here. We hate the Persians." Okay. But the issue is, so Jews get along with the Greeks for a long time. But then, there's this period of instability in the Greek Empire. After Alexander the Great dies, his empire is divided up among his 12 top generals. It's called, not that anybody cares, but it's called the period of the Diadochi, which means 12 guys in Greek. Kind of the main rivalry in the Middle East is between the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. And Israel is kind of the land bridge. And this also goes back to why is Israel always in the news. Because if you want to get to Africa from Asia Minor, you got to go through Israel. If you want to get to Asia Minor from Africa, you got to go through Israel. Well, Africa has very rich, particularly Egypt, has a rich kingdom, very fertile. The source of cotton. The word cotton comes from an Egyptian word. And since we're sitting here in clothing manufacturer, and Asia Minor has very rich trade routes.
Yes.
And so you wind up having to go through Israel, and so everybody wants to control Israel. And so during this period of friction between the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid empires, Israel winds up under the Seleucids. And the Seleucids go through a period of social instability, political instability, economic instability. They're waging all these wars of conquest against other people. They bankrupt the treasury. They wind up with these really corrupt, lunatic kings who beat up everyone around them. And so if you read the book of Maccabees, he takes a look and he says, there's a temple over there in Israel. They don't worship the gods that we worship. They don't like the things that we like. They dress funny. They eat funny. They smell funny. They talk funny.
The book of Maccabees, which religion or what is that?
It's part of the apocryphal books. So, for instance, again, kind of going far afield, but so the Orthodox churches had them in the Greek. And so it's pseudepigrapha because it's First Maccabees, I think, is in the Catholic canon. It is in the Protestant apocrypha books. And for the Orthodox churches, because they use the Septuagint as their base text, it's part of their canonical books.
Got it.
So in the book of Maccabees, Antiochus looks and says, hey, listen, we're broke. They're not. Let's make them pay taxes because they're not Greek. They're not like us. So they're not paying their fair share. And he sends his army and it goes back and forth. And that's where Hanukkah comes from. The Maccabees fight back and it's like, you're not touching our stuff.
Didn't know that.
Beat it, get out of here. But then the Maccabees turn out to be monsters too. I mean, the Hasmonean dynasty, really King Herod, Herod of let's drown all the babies and Jesus and everybody go back to where you came from, fame. Herod marries the last Hasmonean princess, Miriam, winds up killing her brother. He has him drowned. Not a good guy. Really not a good guy. It
kind of doesn't come across that in the Old Testament.
Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
That's correct.
But the point is that what happens with Jewish identity is, so the Israelites, and at the time they still weren't called Judeans, the Israelites really they were called the sons of Judah to some extent, but they look at the Greeks and say, these guys are not our friends. And so what happens is ultimately there's a civil war between two Hasmonean princes, and one of them says to the Romans, listen, we need your help. Could you come over here and chop some heads for us? And the Romans come over and they chop some heads and they put the prince on the throne and they say, but you know what? You guys have really nice date palms and you make some really sweet olive oil. And we had no idea life was so good over here. We're taking a cut. May sound familiar. We want your natural resources in exchange for our help, because where's our thank you?
Correct.
People change. Human nature doesn't.
Nothing new under the sun.
No, not at all. So anyway, the Romans, the Israelites begin rebelling against the Romans because the Romans are exploiting them. And as the economy declines, because the Romans spent a huge amount of money on foreign wars and other things and protecting their colonies, the Romans start pulling more and more taxes out of their colonies. And the Israelites tended to be extremely independent and warlike. And so after the destruction of the Second Temple, I mean, there was a rebellion. There were multiple rebellions against Rome, but the Great Rebellion against Rome was in the year 66 AD to the year 70, which is when the Second Temple was destroyed. And the Romans began referring to the Israelites as Jews, because they referred to them not as Jews religiously, but because they came from the province of Judea.
Got it.
And so they were called Judeans. And that became Jews.
And that was one of many tribes.
Yeah, it was one of
but the one that survived as far as the most amount of people.
Right. Well, because the others kind of got dispersed, and the tribe of Benjamin was never particularly large. So,
And these are all tribes descendant of Abraham?
they're all the tribes descended from Jacob. His 10 sons, and then there were 2 half tribes because his grandsons, the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, actually got a half a tribe each. So there were really 12-ish because there were 12 sons, but there was never a tribe of Joseph. There were the half tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. And so it was, again, if you look, you kind of project forward in terms of waves of the health of a society. So when Roman society was very unhealthy and unstable, they hated Jews. They mapped onto Jews. They're rebellious. They don't worship the right gods. They're holding back on their taxes. We need to deal with them. And that's when Christians split. There was a big rebellion against Rome in the year 117, and there were riots in Rome and in Jewish cities across the Middle East. And so the Christians came to the Romans and said, "Hey, we're not Jewish. We don't know what their problem is, but whatever their problem is, it's not our problem."
Separation.
Right. And so there was really kind of this split, and that's where Christians really legally split from Jews.
So real quick, because I grew up in a Christian church, but very blessed with a grandfather who was an intellect. So he studied, challenged. I got his Bible when he died, and there's not a page that doesn't have questions on it, marks. It's torn to bits. It's duct taped together. And he challenged me to not just accept what they say from the pulpit, et cetera, like this. But so when when Christianity started to rise, there was the Jews and the Christians got along pretty well at the time. Or
it depends. So if you read the Gospels, the first generation of the first generations of Christians, the first generations of the Jewish followers of Christ.
Correct.
Okay, the disciples. And they didn't get along so well with the Jewish authorities at the time. If you read the Gospels, and I wasn't there, I had a teacher once who I loved. And he used to say, "I wasn't there, so I don't really know. But going by what I've read." So I wasn't there. I don't know. And there's certainly a polemic means, there's a religious argumentative side to it, which is the Gospels were largely written under the influence of the Romans hating the Jews and the followers of Christ trying to say, "Hey, it's not Rome we have an issue with, it's them. We're Team Rome."
Got it.
Because we don't want you to kill us.
Interesting.
Okay, but I wasn't there, so I don't really know what happened. But if you look, Jesus would argue with the Pharisees, and Jesus went to the temple and flipped over the tables of the money changers. And so even in that early era, there were friction, but it was a fractious time. So again, anybody who's interested, any of your listeners who wants to learn more about this, if you read the histories of Josephus, and specifically the histories of Josephus at that time, there were numerous Jewish religious factions and political factions. And they were largely fighting with each other. And some of them, part of their fights, they were millennialist, and they were fighting with the Romans, expecting the Romans to be defeated by God, even though they were outnumbered. And so, I explained to people during... I was in the military during the wars against ISIS and Al Qaeda, and there were factions of Jews who were the Jewish version of ISIS and Al Qaeda. Just as an example,
back in the day.
Yeah. So the Romans. There's a debate in the Talmud, which is kind of the large encyclopedia of Jewish legal tradition that was compiled around the year 600 AD in Babylonia. And in the Talmud, there's a debate between 2 rabbis while the Romans were there. And the one said, "These Romans are horrible. They're vile, they're disgusting." And the other rabbi said, "No, actually, they brought some good things to us, civilization." And so the one rabbi who's defending Rome says, they built roads, they built bathhouses, they built marketplaces. We didn't have any of that stuff before they came here. And the other rabbi said they built roads to traffic slaves. They built bathhouses because they're sexual deviants. And they built marketplaces to sell their slaves. And I mean, again, if you go to the developed world, and there are opinions that run the gamut. So, for instance, the anti-colonialists, colonialism is terrible. Anything bad that has ever happened is because of these Europeans who colonized and brutalized and betrayed. And it's in English literature, there's this theory, this literary icon called the noble savage. Okay? It's this person who is authentic indigenous culture, unpolluted by the West. And so it's the noble savage. Have you seen Dances with Wolves?
Yes.
The noble savages. These guys were all humanitarians. Right? Well, then you actually look. Have you been to the American Southwest?
Yes.
Okay, one of my favorite YouTubers actually just died. Tragic situation. He used to go 34, 36 years old, was hit and killed by a drunk driver a month ago.
Oh.
His channel was a desert drifter. And he would go to the American Southwest. He lived, I think, in Grand Junction in Colorado. And he would go to Utah, and he would go off-grid. He was a wilderness guide professionally. Go off-grid and hike into these remote areas where there were these cave dwellings. And he would kind of record them and talk about them without ever disclosing their location, because he was preserving the archaeological value of the site, because they're either being encroached on or because of climate change. A lot of these sites that are 800 or 1,000 years old are now beginning to collapse. So if you've been to the American Southwest and you've seen the cave dwellings.
I have not.
Okay. But I mean, not the cliff dwellings,
I have it
Mesa,
only on, I've seen it on TV.
Yeah, Mesa Verde National Park, all that. Okay. So why did people build on cliffs?
Difficult.
Well, it's hard to get up to, right? Well, there must be a reason that people would expend that kind of energy to build on the edge of a cliff and risk, their 2-year-old falling off the edge.
Yeah, it's militarily, or it's a good defense, being up high. You can see what's coming.
Yeah, but after all, they were noble savages.
Yeah.
Before these awful Europeans came, and I'm not saying the Europeans weren't awful, but before they came, everybody lived in peace and harmony. And it's, hey, you ran out of corn this year, I'll give you some of my corn. Hey, can I borrow a cup of beans? Because we're out of beans over here.
All the human instincts we were talking about before just disappeared.
Yeah, we're a defective species.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what religion is supposed to address, and not be a tool to help the defects. Anyway, the reason is, if you listen to Navajo tradition, because after the collapse of the Incan and Mayan civilizations in South America, some of them migrated north. And they had pretty sophisticated weapons and military training. And they said, we got a bunch of savages here that we can eat. So they literally took their lands, and they are now beginning to realize that some of these archaeological sites are sites where cannibalism was practiced and human beings were butchered, and others were enslaved. So people moved up to the cliffs to protect themselves from these peoples that had migrated north from South America. But so when I say the noble savage, it's this idea that there is some human society that you can find where people are untouched by the basic defects of our nature.
It's all through the perspective of ideology.
Yeah, and
it's
so
whatever ideology you have and the lens you're looking at it, that's what you see.
So your grandfather was looking through the lens of rationalism.
Very, very much
okay.
so. He had a very, very personal relationship with God that you actually believed. But it was built on a detailed dissection of the Word of God, as we describe, and that for him was the Old Testament and the New Testament. But the Old Testament is what we studied, because he strongly believed in the Old Testament and it being the foundation. He believed in foundational principles.
Yeah, which is, again, your grandfather was a product of the educational system in which he was raised and the era in which he was raised. What year was he born?
Oh, probably 1920s, something like that.
And where?
Massachusetts. Or, well, he was born in Massachusetts, but I mean, his parents, my great-grandparents, just came over from Sicily.
Okay, so they were Catholic. He was raised Protestant?
He was raised Catholic and then converted.
And became a Congregationalist.
That's Christian is what, but I go back and forth. He'd actually say, well, Catholic, Christian, same thing. But on, the split at the time, it was the Catholics.
And everybody who was not Catholic.
And then he became what they were deeming as a born-again Christian, and they were diametrically opposed growing up. His family is like, what did you do?
Right. Well, because the Catholic Church in that era, and again, I'm overgeneralizing, so that's the first thing.
Yes.
You always have to overgeneralize.
And I'm speaking to a very specific
but the Catholic Church is very much founded, there's always a tension between revelation and reason. Revelation is Joshua made the sun stand still. Okay, that's revelation. Reason is the sun can't stand still. It must have been a perception. Okay, so American Protestantism, based on really English, the Protestant movements, and the Protestants who came over, they believed in the individual experience of religion and the individual encounter with the Bible. And so actually, there was a vote on which would be the official language of the United States. Number 1 was English. Number 2 was Hebrew. And number 3 was German.
When did this happen?
This was pre-colonial, during the colonial period about, which religion, which language. And the early Protestants in England studied Hebrew intensively, and it was part of a tradition of the Enlightenment. I'd sent you that article about Johannes Reuchlin. So the Renaissance humanists studied Hebrew because they wanted to understand the Bible in its original language, because they felt that was an authentic encounter. So today, if somebody says, I had a kid when I taught at the Naval Academy who came up to me and he said, Chaplain, I wish I could believe in religion and the Bible, because my friends who believe in the Bible and believe in religion seem so much more at peace with me. Seem so much more at peace. He said, but I just can't believe it. It just doesn't make any sense. And I said to him, as a humanist, and I'm very liberal. That's my own theology. I come from an extremely liberal tradition. And what I said to him is, you can read the Bible as the greatest anthology of human wrestling with what it means to be a human being. And all human beings in their lifetime, if they live a fulfilled life, have to address 3 things. What was here before we got here?
Correct.
What is going to be here after we leave? And what am I supposed to do while I'm here? Those are the 3 great questions that any religious system deals with. And I said, so if you read the Bible, you're looking at roughly a 2,000-year anthology of different opinions in different times, different political circumstances, different economic circumstances, different geographies and countries, of hundreds of people saying, what does it mean to me to be human?
And what was his response?
He said, I hadn't looked at it that way. But for me,
I haven't
really
looked
is.
At it that way.
Yeah. So people who are secular can still look. Now, am I opposed in America to teaching? Well, to begin with, there's a problem with saying the Bible. Okay, which Bible? Because there's the Hebrew Bible, and then there's the post Old Testament or post Hebrew scriptures. Okay, so you're going to teach the Old Testament, New Testament. Are you going to approach it through the lens of Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures. Okay, then there's the Orthodox churches, which use the Septuagint as their foundational text. So they have books that the Catholics don't have. The Catholics have books that Protestants don't accept. The Protestant Reformation said, we're going to go back, and anything that Jerome, when he did the Vulgate translation, anything that he couldn't find a Hebrew or Aramaic antecedent to, he labeled deuterocanonical.
Deuterocanonical.
Canonical means kind of a secondary level of sanctity.
Got it.
Okay, but modern Protestants, for the most part, don't use the Apocrypha at all. I mean, if you go to most Baptist churches, you're not going to see people preaching from the book of, Fourth Maccabees. Okay? Not even First Maccabees. They don't get... So, my challenge is we don't have that many people who are biblically literate. We have people who have read the Bible, their Bible, whatever their Bible is.
And I would disagree that within my own circle, the amount of people that have actually read the Bible shocks me that they haven't. I always tell people, just read Genesis. It's one of the most insane books you'll ever read.
Yeah, these giants walking around, eating people and having babies with them.
Yeah,
and then
it's
the next thing you know,
science fiction. And people, all they know is God created the heavens and the earth. They know, they have sound bites. They live a religious soundbite life without. And I don't think that there is in my life, I haven't seen. I have very few people, and I have some great friends. Rob, I'll throw your name out there, who does deep dives on this, and really wants to know the answers, and but that just doesn't exist. The curiosity to understand just doesn't exist, and then but the hatred. I mentioned before, you see this rise in anti-Semitism, rise against Judeo-Christian values, just the basic values. They're being attacked.
Yeah. And I will say, by the way, and again, kind of the term Judeo-Christian is a misnomer.
Okay.
Because what we tend to read as Judeo-Christian values are really Western Enlightenment values. It's not Judeo-Christian.
Go into more detail on that.
Well, again, what is authentically Christian? Well, believing in Christ.
Correct.
Okay. Once you get past that, there's really a diversity of opinions. So, for instance, a lot of my doctoral research was in the fight between the Orthodox Christians and the Monophysites, they were called, in Mesopotamia, specifically in two Mesopotamian cities, Edessa and Urhoi. Edessa and Nisibis. Okay, so Christians were killing each other because one said Christ was born divine and human simultaneously, and the other group of Christians said, no, he was fully human when he was born, and then he became divine when he was baptized and the dove settled on him, and that was a sign that the Holy Spirit had now entered his body and he was now divine. And Christians killed each other over that. Okay, so if Christians, there's no such thing as a Christian tradition. There's no such thing as a Jewish tradition. There were Pharisees, there were Sadducees, there were Essenes, there were, the various tribes. If you read the book of Judges, they believe different things. Where the modern Samaritans are, they worshipped at Mount Gerizim. And there was no central temple in Jerusalem, and the centrality of the temple in Jerusalem wasn't accepted really fully until the restoration and the second temple was built. And the Samaritans, who lived kind of in the north, they were the descendants of the Israelites, the 10 tribes who lived there, and the Assyrian settlers who intermarried. And so the Judeans said, you guys aren't Jews. The Good Samaritan, the parable of Good Samaritan. So the Judeans said, you guys aren't Jews. And the Samaritans said, no, we're the real Jews. You guys aren't Jews. We're the real Israelites. You guys because you went to Babylonia and you got influenced by these people and you guys are modernists. And I'll just give you a quick example. When you talk about the Bible, everybody knows what Hebrew letters look like, but they're not Hebrew. They're not Jewish. Actually, the Samaritans use the first 5 books of Moses, the first 5 books of, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, but it's written in, it's called Paleo Hebrew script. It's actually authentic Hebrew script. And what is called Hebrew script now is actually a cursive script that was Assyrian cursive. Because really? Jews, when they went to Babylonia, they learned this new script, and it's a different alphabet. And so when they come back, if you read the book of Ezra, Ezra institutes the public reading of the law from an authorized version of the Bible. Why does he do it? Because it's written in the Babylonian script. And it's a way of saying, this is a purity test. Are you a real Jew? Or are you one of those kind of crooked Jews who, you slept with Assyrians, your mother was an Assyrian, okay? And so there's no authentic Judeo tradition. There's no authentic Christian tradition. There's what we refer to as Judeo-Christian values are really the post-Enlightenment values of the deists, George Washington and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, which was based on kind of a universalist set of assumptions that all human beings, we hold these truths to be all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberties, and the pursuit of happiness. This idea that all people are entitled and all people are equal, and even the people who voted to become the first colonies, to become the first states, they didn't believe it because they didn't believe that their black slaves
of course,
were created equal. They didn't believe that the Native Americans were created equal. It was always, and so the Bible and the Judeo-Christian value system that your grandfather was raised with, it wasn't a stated fact. It was a goal to aspire to.
Which is a good goal to aspire to.
Which is a good goal. But right now,
and potentially, religions followed correctly are goals to aspire to.
Yeah. But like the anti-Soros rhetoric, because we've talked about anti-Semitism on the left. Anti-Semitism on the right, the anti-Semitism on the left is basically this neo-Marxist post-colonial rage. Okay? The anti-Semitism on the right, some of it is theological anti-Semitism. If you read the Gospel of John, when Jesus is being tried, and Mel Gibson, okay? If you've seen, the Passion of the Christ. Mel Gibson is a theological anti-Semite. He reads the book of John, and the Jews said, and who elected them, the Jews? Like, they didn't speak for everybody, but, and I wasn't there, I don't know if the leadership actually said it or not, but they said, upon us and our children be his death. Okay, so that became the foundation for theological anti-Semitism throughout the Middle Ages.
That makes, actually, I understand that.
They won't embrace Christ, so they're evil, so we need to punish them. But theological anti-Semitism, just kind of very quickly, because I know we're getting up on an hour already, but theological anti-Semitism...
We'll just go for 8 hours, don't worry about it.
All night long. We could do part 2.
We will definitely do part 2. I'm so intrigued. This is very interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating
it really
intellectual movement. Theological anti-Semitism said as soon as you converted, you were okay. You were Team Jesus. So we don't hold a grudge. Because your baptism absolved you of your original sin and the sins of your ancestors. So if you were Jewish, and then you converted, and there were famous Jews in the Middle Ages who converted to Christianity. And many of them bent over backwards, and they were some of the most rabid anti-Semites around because the Jewish... Their Jewish relatives said he did it for the money. And the Christians said he's the most pure because, we were baptized into this as infants. We didn't know any different. But look at that. He was raised in this vile, filthy, sin-filled culture, and he rose above it. And he recognized truth independently. So we love him more than we even love our own.
Wow.
So that was theological anti-Semitism. And there's still remnants of theological anti-Semitism. I had a dispute with a guy in the Navy who published on his Facebook page that Jesus is the law of life and that the Old Testament is the law of death. And I said, what you're doing is, and he was not at his core anti-Semitic, but he was anti-Jewish. And I said, there are people that serve in uniform alongside you who follow the law of Moses. And you saying this is the law of death makes it more difficult for us to practice our faith. And he was an officer. So I said, so you may be setting up enlisted to be persecuted by people who listen to you on Sunday. And he said, I'm not an anti-Semite. I love Israel. I love Jews. Then there's racial anti-Semitism. And if you look at, again, it's fascinating. I think his name was Nutt. He was one of the founders. He was the founder of the medical school in Alabama, in Mobile, Alabama. Vile racist. In the 1840s and 50s, published hateful things and studying all the races on earth. And there was a rabbi who had come over from Belgium, who was a rabbi who wrote him a letter about, this is so brilliant, this is so wonderful, your work is, you've identified it correctly, because look, Jews are all the same. They're all white and smart. Well, there were Jews from Syria, Jews from Iraq, Jews from Ethiopia. Jews aren't all white. But this guy, he wrote this horrible thing, but it was based on racial characteristics in the 1840s and 50s. The Nazis and these Nazi master race guys, they based their ideology on American racist writings and racial pseudoscience from the United States in the 1840s and 1850s that kind of predated but immediately fit in with Darwin and this idea of a master race. What's his name now? I'm blanking on his name now. The German philosopher who wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche. Nietzsche writes about kind of this post sentimental religious movements and human ideologies. And he said, we have to be ruthless. There's an article the other day about the death of or the decline of empathy in Western societies, particularly in the United States right now. This idea that empathy is a weakness, not a strength. And Nietzsche proposed this, there's nothing new. And so the Nazis said, look, we are good people and we are human. So of course we are inclined to feel sorry for the Jews we have to kill, but we have to do it for the good of the human race and evolution. And it fit in with American racial politics and American racial ideology in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s.
The canary in the coal mine.
The canary in the coal mine. So right now, here's the problem that I see. American society is undergoing a tremendous upheaval. There's in the Talmud, there's an expression, "my nafka mina." What is so? We've had these arguments going back and forth for 22 pages already in Aramaic, and I believe this and you believe that. So what's the practical consequence of this? And in Yiddish, there's an expression, nu vuden. Okay, so now what? So what is the practical consequence of this? The rise of anti-Semitism that we're seeing in America right now is a symptom of a sick social system. Anti-Semitism isn't driving change in America. Change in America and unease and discomfort with the pace of change, the nature of change, and the direction of change is driving people to show whatever movie they want on the movie screen. And so it's a political right-wing narrative of the Jews are globalists. They're bringing brown people in, the great replacement thing. On the left, it's Jews are colonialists. They're part of the oppression of, the indigenous peoples. There are people who are returning to religion, and there's particularly an upsurge in people returning to the Catholic Church.
Yeah, you had mentioned that, yeah.
Yeah, so J.D. Vance, who was raised in an evangelical Christian
Excuse me.
setting, who embraces the Catholic Church and a conservative Catholic Church. So it's my watch reminding me the parking meter's running.
Absolutely. Well,
So basically the answer to your question is anti-Semitism right now, because there's so much social angst, so many people are looking for a way to make sense of it in a situation that you can't make sense of.
Understood. The canary in the coal mine.
Canary in the coal mine.
Scapegoat mentality, a level of social anxiety, perhaps fear, lack of direction, and they're projecting their fears onto Jews.
Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ryan.
My
this was
goodness,
fun. I got to use my brain.
Well, my brain is boiling right now. I think you overloaded me. I think it's fantastic. I could do this for hours.
If you want to wait a few months and we can do part 2 and sort of,
absolutely,
which form of anti-Semitism seems to have the upper
I
hand
think
right now.
Yeah, we can definitely go in. Yeah, let's go into a deeper dive. I guarantee you this is going to be we're going to get a lot of comments on this, and I'll do my best. And if I've got any questions, I'll reach out to you, and you can answer questions as they come in. Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Real People, Real Life. Our passion is to have real conversations with real people who've made it. Real people who've made it, who did it on their own terms. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, catch us on Twitter or X at RPRL Podcast and on YouTube at Real People, Real Life Podcast.